I'd like to formally welcome you to our event today. I'm Vladimir Enlow, Information Coordinator for You Have the Power. And on behalf of You Have the Power, I'd like to welcome you to Our Turn to Talk, aka the Crime Survivors Roundtable. This event is part of National Crime Victims' Rights Week, an annual observance intended to raise awareness of the rights of crime survivors, highlight the programs and services available to them, and honor their journeys towards safety and resolution. The goal of this event is to provide a forum where survivors can communicate what they need in terms of resources, especially in light of the ongoing pandemic and the national conversation about police-community relations. We hope you'll leave this presentation with resources that can help you in your survivor's journey or help other people through theirs. But most of all, we want you to come away with the understanding that there are people who share your experiences and your frustrations. We hope it's an opportunity for you to connect with each other and find solutions and healing, even after today's event is long past. I should mention Our Turn to Talk is funded by the National Association of VOCA Assistance Administrators, or NAVAA, through a grant from the Office for Victims of Crime, through the Office of Justice Programs, U.S. Department of Justice, to promote community awareness of crime victims' rights and services. Now, many of you by now are already familiar with the controls in Zoom, but just for the record, you can enter any questions you have for the panelists at large or for specific panelists in the Q&A section. The chat section is for anything you'd like to share with everyone present. If you'll just allow me to share my screen for a second. Before I introduce our moderator and panelists, I'd like to say a few words about You Have the Power. Former First Lady of Tennessee, Andrea Conti, founded YHTP in 1993, following a kidnapping attempt and her own disorienting experiences with the criminal justice system. Now, here's a little bit of information about our agency from our CEO, Kathy Gurley.
You Have the Power is a nonprofit that educates, advocates, and empowers victims and communities impacted by crime. Many of us will hear stories about sex trafficking or other crimes and not think of it as affecting our own backyard. Unfortunately, it is right here, and it affects many, many walks of life. You Have the Power serves the community in a multitude of ways. Not only if somebody has been victimized, we can help them find the resources they need to regain their stability and help bring awareness to a number of issues to help these people and communities be stronger and safer.
Part of the work that YHTP does involves producing documentaries and resource guides on contemporary issues in crime prevention, such as child sexual abuse and sex trafficking. We also present community safety training sessions for caregivers, educators, and the public. Finally, we provide a victim impact curriculum for adults in prison. Currently, we have that in place at the Deborah K. Johnson Rehabilitation Center, formerly the Tennessee Prison for Women. And we use this curriculum to develop something similar for at-risk youth, developed through community groups. Now, a little bit about our moderator and panelists. First, I would like to introduce our moderator, Tony Gonzalez. He's a news editor for 90.3 WPLN News. He's invested a decade into covering the news and telling empathetic stories across Middle Tennessee, both with the Tennessean and WPLN. His work often intersects with that of You Have the Power, as he has closely covered vulnerable populations, child well-being, and sexual assault. Tony, thank you for joining us today and serving as our moderator.
Hey, thank you, Vladimir. Appreciate it. I'd love to introduce the panelists if that works for you. But yeah, good morning. I appreciate even being invited to take part. So yeah, I'm a journalist. So I'm a storyteller, which means I'm usually telling other people's stories, experiences that are not mine. It's a serious responsibility. One of the key ingredients that I've always I think a lot about, my entire staff does, is listening, and listening with empathy. So I know that in today's conversation, that's what I'm thinking about doing, listening and learning. So I'm going to go ahead and take a moment to introduce today's panelists, and then we'll have this conversation for about an hour. We have it based around 5 questions for our panelists. And then all of our participants, all of you, you're invited to share questions in the Q&A box. So there's the chat box, but we're going to ask you to use the Q&A box in Zoom if you'd like to float questions. I'll help direct those to our panelists, and then we will also have some open Q&A at the end. So, but we'll get into our introductions. First up, Jared Effler. He is the District Attorney General for the 8th Judicial District. So that's a 5-county area, if I'm right, 5-county area north of Crossville and Knoxville. He's also the chairperson for the Victim Witness Steering Committee, which is within the Tennessee District Attorneys General Conference. We have Avis Littleton, who has worked in women and children's ministries for 20 years and is also a Vanderbilt Divinity School graduate. Avis is also a crime survivor herself, and we'll be able to speak to that today during our panel. We have Alexandra Porto, the Executive Director of Fayette Cares in West Tennessee. The nonprofit was founded 35 years ago, and Alexandra has been there for more than 2 decades. Fayette Cares works on a number of things, including homelessness prevention, domestic violence interventions, and self-sufficiency after people experience crisis. We have Sharon Travis, someone who's actually been helpful to me in my reporting here in Nashville through the Nashville Sexual Assault Center. She's also a community outreach and prevention specialist and co-facilitator of the Victim Impact Curriculum, which is run by You Have the Power. Hi, Sharon. And our final panelist, Elder Oliver T. Williams, who is the senior pastor of the Grace Church of God in Christ, which is in Memphis. He's also the founder of the church's Hope Center. Services there include domestic violence intervention, fatherhood programs, and counseling. Additionally, he is a co-facilitator of the Youth Impact Curriculum by You Have the Power. That curriculum works with at-risk youth at 2 high schools in Shelby County. That's Elder Williams. Thanks for being here.
Yes, thank you, Tony. Now, at this point, Tony is going to be guiding our presentation, but I'll be coming back in at the end to introduce some helpful resources for both advocates and survivors. Now, I guess we can start off with our first question.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, so let's get into it. We're going to start with Alexandra on our just opening question here. Alexandra, can you just talk a little bit about, what are the most impactful ways that crime affects victims? And then, how has our understanding of these impacts influenced the movement for victims' rights, locally or nationally?
Absolutely, Tony, and thank you all. Really thrilled to be a part of this and honored, frankly. And I think it's a wonderful thing that we're having these conversations to be able to serve victims of crime. I can speak primarily on the issues of domestic violence, having that being an area where I've personally been affected, but also professionally involved. Domestic violence victims are impacted physically, emotionally, and mentally by the abuse they experience. And the physical impact of domestic violence is often the easiest to notice, but the physical impact goes way beyond what we can see. And of course, with crime victims, they often suffer a broad range of psychological and social injuries that persist long after their physical wounds have ever healed. There are these intense feelings of anger and fear and isolation, low self-esteem, helplessness, depression. Those are all very common reactions to victimization. And in many cases, like combat veterans, crime victims might suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, and that can include, recurrent memories of the incident, sleep disturbances, feelings of alienation, of isolation, of emotional numbing, and other, anxiety-related symptoms. For survivors of prolonged repeated trauma, like domestic violence victims who suffer constant violent assaults or the threat of violence, that can affect that they struggle sometimes to navigate daily life, just living under constant fear. There's a loss of a belief that this world is meaningful and just, and that there are good and decent people in it. The emotional damage too, and that social isolation can cause by victimization is also compounded by the lack of support and even the stigmatization sometimes from friends and family and social institutions, that can be re-victimizing or even a second wound for the victim. Sometimes friends and family members withdraw or even blame victims, and that of course compounds the trauma of the event. That lack of support for victims while they're trying to recover from a crime can just exacerbate the psychological harm caused by victimization and make recovery even more difficult.
Alexandra, I wonder, and everyone can jump in as well, but do you feel like, I mean, all of this intense impact that you're describing is well understood enough, or that it's mostly survivors who are carrying this? Or I mean, have we moved the needle as a community toward understanding?
I can't say that it's understood enough, not just by, service providers, I'm sorry, not just our communities, but even sometimes victims don't recognize that, not just physical harm is a crime, that the impact of crime, I should say, but all of those emotional and, underlying issues that they don't recognize. So I think there is a lot to be done still to understand that impact of crime.
Do we have other opening thoughts here? I know maybe Avis had indicated she might want to address this question. We're talking about, what are the impactful ways that crime affects victims, and how has our understanding as a community changed or not about these impacts?
Hello, I am Avis Littleton. I'm glad to be here. Glad that everyone is here. And impact, I'm here as a professional and as a victim of child sexual abuse and domestic violence. And when I think of the effects of the crime, I think of what it did to my value of myself and how I showed up for my family, how I show up for on my job because of what I think about myself. Uh, Simple as a breathing. I didn't breathe. I couldn't breathe. It changed. It impacted my blood pressure. It how I raised my children, just how I viewed life, and which is some things I was aware of, but some ways I was paralyzed and was unaware of how I was impacted. And but the biggest thing is what I thought about myself, and how that limited how I function in my daily life. And that was even going back. I couldn't be what I wanted to be, and that even made me feel worse because I knew what my best was in when it came to domestic violence, and I knew that I had education, and I knew that I had a faith in God. Yet I was not showing up in that way, and spiritually thinking, sometimes I didn't even feel as though my faith community could understand what I was going through, because I felt like I should have been responding more faithfully, and I felt bad even about that. So there were a lot of secrets that I held as well.
Oh, yeah, Avis, I appreciate you sharing that. Alexandra as well. Thank you for sharing and kind of getting us started here. Is there anyone else who'd care to weigh in on the impact of crime on victims? I can move into our next question as well. I appreciate you sharing it. Just listening to you, Avis, thinking about the amount of time that it takes to even understand yourself. I mean, it's not like understanding is so sudden. Well, I think we'll I haven't seen any Q&A yet, by the way. So folks, if you're having thoughts coming to mind, you can send those in there and we'll keep an eye on that. Jared, we're going to turn to you for the next question here about resources, which is, I'm hoping you could just talk a little bit about what resources do you believe, survivors are finding helpful in the days, weeks, or like we said, time passes, or in the months after experiencing a crime. What do you find to be some of the most valuable resources for survivors?
Well, Tony, thank you for the question, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. I'm blessed to be in a position to where I can be a voice for crime victims. Something that I hold near and dear to my heart. And I'm honored to work with Tennessee's other elected 31 district attorneys on how we can improve how the criminal justice system treats crime victims. And this is a very timely question for National Crime Victims' Rights Week. It also coincides with a recent survey that we formed with victims throughout the state of Tennessee. And we asked them, what resource would have helped you better navigate the criminal justice system? And overwhelmingly, most victims said that they simply wanted someone to sit down and explain the system to them. And, informational pamphlets and video clips and online resources, all of that is very, very important. But I believe it's very important for us to never lose focus that what that victim wants more than anything is empathy, and someone to not only answer their questions and talk with them, but I think just as important, to listen to them. And in my district, we're a very rural district. Geographically, we're one of the largest in the state. And I believe that really is demonstrated itself in how we treat victims here. And by example, we had the first rural family justice center in the state of Tennessee. And when we got to looking at the numbers of how we were treating domestic violence victims in Scott County, where we have our first family justice center, we saw that almost 90% of our domestic violence victims were appearing in court. And unfortunately, we don't have that type of participation in the other counties. And I think it goes back directly to what I said earlier. With the Family Justice Center model, we're having that one-on-one, that face time with service providers that victims need. And again, I think that it's just so important that crime victims have someone they can either meet with in person, or if they're having a bad day, someone they can pick up the phone and just talk to. And I believe that it's very important that we convey that to our legislature. Unfortunately, Tennessee is lagging most other states in the number of victim service providers that we have per capita. And I think that's something that we all can work on to ensure that crime victims get the services they so desperately need and deserve.
Jared, I have one follow-up. We do have a question that's coming as well. Open, obviously, to the panelists also weighing in on this resources question. What resources are helpful? I'm curious, Jared. It sounds like you're saying there's widespread, almost overwhelming support for that face-to-face meeting. Are there any other resources that are offered out there that surprised you? Like it sounds like you maybe survey survivors. Is there anything that maybe surprised you that as an offering that you didn't realize that maybe people were needing?
Honestly, not really, Tony. I mean, the things such as financial support, safety, security, all of those things, showed up on our survey. But overwhelmingly, of what crime victims said they wanted is just, that one-on-one contact, someone who would take the time and explain the process to that victim.
Yeah. I want to open it up before we get to the question that's come in. Do any of the other panelists want to weigh in on what resources you think are really especially helpful after a crime?
I'd like to share a bit. We've certainly seen some very positive, Alexandra Porto here with Fayette Cares. We've seen some very positive response to teaching law enforcement, particularly with the lethality assessment program that we've launched out in our area, which not only gives training to law enforcement about particularly domestic violence, responding to those victims, understanding the patterns of abuse and seeing that with a broader lens than just the incident that happened that night or that day that they're responding to, and being able to be the voice to the victim of concern. Again, to your point of empathy and the need to connect with people, those officers are being taught to convey their concern for this victim's well-being, because with a tool, they're able to flag a high danger victim and then say, I'm concerned that you might be killed, which is not typically how they're communicating with law enforcement. Law enforcement are there to investigate, to make an arrest, to move on. But with this program, that's doing a different take on, I'm worried about you. You could die. The studies show you're in a very dangerous situation, and I want to help. So we're seeing some of that.
Yeah, I want to actually follow up on that. It's actually dovetails closely with the question that had come into us, which you've I think started to answer, but I'll offer it up because there's some nuance here. The question that had come in was, what is being done to better educate law enforcement about how to respond to crime? Do they know what to look for? Like, does the victim's statement match the body language? Were children present when the incident occurred? That sort of thing. There's also a question in here about training for judges as well on the topic, especially those providing over domestic violence. So it sounds like the lethality assessment is obviously up this alley, but is there more you could expand on about that, about some of the particulars that might be in the training now?
About the training? Yeah, so we, for example, recently, with a perspective on how COVID is impacting victims, some of the training that was geared towards law enforcement and their response was just understanding how the tactics that abusers use to maintain power and control are now augmented by this isolation and the fear of the pandemic and being trapped with an abuser. So helping the officers recognize that there are things that abusers use to exert power and control over victims, and how our situation with this health crisis has made things worse, substantially worse for many victims. So that kind of training is going on. And yes, things like helping them, speak privately with the victim so that they are not concerned about what the children are hearing or what the abuser is hearing. In many cases, body cams that are used, this is all admissible evidence. So either speaking privately or turning off the body cam so there can be a private conversation, without fear of something being said that's going to be problematic to that victim, and then withholding some very important information. So that type of training is going on with our lethality assessment partners.
Yeah, body camera is certainly an emerging subject. We could spend a whole hour on that probably. I do want to give our other panelists another moment on this question. Other thoughts or anything you'd want to surface about how law enforcement is being educated to interact with victims? I'll give it a beat here. And if not, we can keep moving. Okay. Great. Well, we'll keep moving here and appreciate the. Oh wait, we do have one follow up here. I believe maybe on the lethality assessment. Is the training offered statewide?
So it's certainly available and free. It has not become mandatory, which I think, and I've heard it from police chiefs who have said, this just needs to be standard up, So currently it's not mandated, but we have seen a very positive response from our law enforcement partners. There's, if anything, it helps them, of course. Part of what the lethality assessment program does is connects the officer and the victim with service providers on the spot. So in real time, a victim is talking to a service provider that's helping them safety plan, that's helping them access resources, think about their situation and their needs. So that's something that helps the officers tremendously. They're not counselors, they're not trained in these techniques, so they can turn it over to a professional who can help right on the spot, and they're finding that very valuable. And they're also seeing this is it's helping to break that cycle. law enforcement tend to respond to the same household often, but when a victim doesn't really have the resources to make a change in this situation, or, the abuser isn't, all of these, it just plays into a perpetual cycle until somebody is killed or seriously injured. So officers are very positively responding to that this can really help get that victim the resources that they need to make a serious change in their circumstance if they're able to.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I see that Avis has unmuted herself. I think she is ready to share.
Yes, I
Go for
am.
it.
I want to share an experience. A woman that had the domestic violence issue and her experience with the police, and she felt that the police was so kind and so helpful to her that it met her. She had a gown on. She even had blood on her gown. She had no makeup. Her hair was all over her head, and he made her feel beautiful in the sense, valued. He was kind. It wasn't just protection that he provided for her. And this was a Black woman, and it was a white police, and this white police gave her kindness, and in a sense that he made sure, not for just safety, but helped her pick up the house, help her feel uh, and that's what she remembered the most when she was talking to me, was not even safety, but that she was noticed, she wasn't invisible, and that kindness that a police, and a white police, to the point that it wasn't even anymore whether he was white. He was a person that showed her kindness at her most vulnerable time, and when she didn't feel good about herself. I mean, you think about it. You're out, you have a gown on that's ripped, that has blood, your hair's over here, you have no makeup on, and someone made you feel valued. And I remember that account of the woman, and I just want to share that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm going to ask our next question, unless there's anybody wanting to. I see Sharon may be ready to chat, although the next question was coming Sharon's way anyway. You're ready. Okay, great.
Yes.
Our next question is still right on this topic. It's all obviously related, but what resources do you wish were available to survivors from police, hospitals, or service providers? Sharon, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. First, I just want to say thank you guys for having me on this call. And I've been quiet up to this point because my answers all kind of supplement the previous questions. So my wish list kind of is my response to the other two questions that have already hit the floor. So the first thing on my wish list is that we have more trauma-informed care training for everybody. That would be law enforcement, that would be nurses, doctors, it can be advocates, and also expanding kind of this advocate model. At the Sexual Assault Center, we have advocates who respond to every sexual assault that happens to the hospital. So I really understood Jared's comment about having someone who's there to listen. And their role is to do just that, just listen, to hear what you need, and to let you know what your rights are, let you know what to expect in the process so that there are no surprises. Because we know what the trauma response might do to a person's body. It's not just what they're thinking cognitively, but it's how their body is also responding, that somatic response. And so paying attention to that somatic response and recognizing that it could be fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, could be that trauma response, and knowing how to handle each of those. And they may not want law enforcement involvement, as is the case with a lot of the sexual assaults we see. They don't want law enforcement right away because they can't handle it in that moment, but it may be later, and them understanding at what point they can invite law enforcement into that process. Also making sure that those trauma-informed care trainings are also acculturated so that they look different in different communities. So how you respond to one person in one community might not be the right response in another community. I loved Avis's example of showing up and just being kind and just listening and hearing what the other person is needing and not making assumptions, coming in with a bit of cultural humility, saying, you know what, I don't understand exactly what you need in this moment, but tell me what you need, you know, and hearing them. And if they don't have the voice to say it, then just being a comfort. Recognizing that often when you're a victim of crime, one of the things you lose first is your voice. And so you may have to give a person some time to regather their thoughts and regain that voice. And to the degree that you can empower them to have that voice again is the way that we would like to see them move forward, because then their choice that was just taken away as being a crime victim has now been given back. So what you don't want to do is take that ability to have your voice away, you know, so you want to create space for that to happen. I am also wishing that we provided more resources for children who might be vicariously impacted by this crime. Because if your parent is the one that has been impacted, they may not be able to show up for their kids right away. And they may need, those children need support too. They need to understand how to process vicarious trauma. They need positive youth programs to help them kind of find their voice and regain their voice. Because what we know about trauma is it can be generational and it can be passed down through the DNA and it can be passed down behaviorally. So what you really want to do is create some space. What I would like to see is more programs for these children so that they don't themselves either become victims or offenders. And we know with DV, the largest indicator that someone will become a sexual assault offender is if they were a child who witnessed sexual assault. I'm sorry, a child who witnessed domestic violence. So it's the DV thing that caused them, because it's not about sex, it's about power, control, domination, and manipulation. So what that child is doing is trying to get their voice back, right? When that happens. And so we got to pay attention to how these things are being passed down to the kids. And it's not about them wanting to be an offender, it's them getting a voice, finding their power, finding their voice. And the sooner we can do that while they're young and trainable, the better it is. The other thing on my wish list is more material resources, especially if we're talking Nashville and housing. Oh my gosh. I have had many victims need housing and every bed was full. And there was no place for them to go, especially as we gentrify. And we end up having to tap into other counties who are also full. Our surrounding counties are also full. So creating some space for people who have limited resources and need material resources. Also on my wish list is that VOCA funds, Victims of Crime Act funds, that there are funds out there for victims of crime, but people don't know that they're there and that they're more easily accessible. They're there, but it is a process to get that money. And so knowing what that process is and simplifying that process is definitely on my wish list. Also, when it comes to developing programs, response, and all of those types of things in the community with our service providers, I really wish we had a more diverse leadership, you know, who are sitting at the table and helping them shape these choices and shaping these decisions. And that the leadership that we do have is more culturally sensitive to how these things look different in different communities. One of the things that I work with right now is Black Client Services at the Sexual Assault Center. I'm going to use that as an example because we looked at our data a few years back to see who we were serving. And at that time, we were serving about 95% white women when it came to sexual assault, if we eliminate the kids. Now, about 50% of our clients are kids. When it came to the kids, they actually represented the proportion that they are in the population because these are DCS referrals or school referrals, right? And so because of that referral base that was showing up. But when it came to our adult survivors, it was just white women, basically. So we had to look at what we were missing. And we know statistically that Black women are impacted, or even marginalized communities are impacted to a higher degree when it comes to these crimes for a variety of different reasons. And so we had to look at what we needed to do to create space for people to feel more comfortable. And what we realized is that the model we were using, that's just come in and do therapy model, doesn't work in every community at one-on-one therapy. And so we started doing things like book clubs, group therapy, programs like more awareness programs where we could come in collectively and have conversations about this. So we were having community conversations. And from those community conversations and book clubs came our one-on-one clients, but we could not start with one-on-one approaches. So being more creative and thinking outside the box about how we reach different cultures. With our Latino or Latinx community, we recognized we had a barrier with language. That was our first thing. Let's fix the language barrier, and then let's put people in those communities, situate them in those communities so that they can have access. Because maybe transportation is an issue, language is an issue, childcare is an issue. So thinking outside the box about how we reach these different communities in the way that they need to be reached also requires having people in leadership who could speak to those things and bring those creative ideas to bear.
Yeah. Well, Sharon, that's quite a list. You probably have some participants here who are going to want to print out of your wish list. You going to put that out somewhere? Be careful too. You might make news or something. I don't know. There's some very interesting ideas, and I'm taking notes on my end. Is there anybody else who wants to weigh in? Does anybody else want to add anything else to the wish list? Resources that you wish were available to survivors from police, hospitals, or service providers. Obviously, Sharon's provided a lot to us, but I'll open the floor for just a moment. Well, Sharon, I really appreciate you bringing that list to bear. That's really, really informative. Okay, well, I'm going to direct the next question for starters to Oliver, Elder Williams, and we've almost touched on this a couple times already about the pandemic, and I'm hearing Jared earlier talking about the importance of face-to-face and some of the other maybe increased difficulties during the pandemic. So the question here for Elder Williams, has the pandemic made it harder for victims of crime to get the resources they need? And if so, how do we get around those obstacles? So yes, talk a little bit about pandemic specific. How are these resources being used?
Well, first, Tony, thank you for the question, and thank you all for having me. It is an honor to be with you. To begin with the pandemic, of course, I'll say it this way, that we're experiencing a pandemic within a pandemic plus a pandemic. The first place I'd like to start is that, the struggle with being able to offer face-to-face, of course, creates a challenge. But the reality is, what face are we seeing when it is present? I raised the second part of the pandemic of this issue of we have a pandemic being COVID-19, and then we have an ongoing pandemic being domestic violence. And so with violence in community, we're asking the question, has the pandemic made it harder? I first would like to say that the initial pandemic of domestic violence hadn't gone anywhere. The pandemic just increased more violence, according to the data that we're seeing from the CDC. With schools closing and children being at home, then children are also more exposed to that violence as well. And in West Tennessee, where I reside, we have other issues that are critical factors to violence, be it poverty and some of the systematic issues that relate to violence itself, which gets to my third pandemic, which is the faith community and some of the teachings, if you will, that reinforce power and control. And so when I took approach to this question, I began to ask myself, how do we get the victims of crime what they need? And then I start asking myself first, how did we overcome being able to more or less educate during the pandemic? We had to shift from in-person to virtual. And so in the youth impact curriculum that we facilitate at the Hope Center at Grace, we did a lot of things virtually. However, that in-person impact is something that I don't think that you can put in a bottle and sell. We have more impact with face-to-face, but one of the ways of which that a lot of the schools that I've worked with have utilized space, it allows us to continue some face-to-face work because of space being provided. So one of the ways of which that we got around the obstacle of the pandemic is continuing to try that if there's a door that's closed, then we climb through the window, right? And so for us, instead of us hearing that there's an obstacle and giving up in the fight, we did everything we could to create capacity and continue the process. Another area that we've seen within the which I almost wanted to add another pandemic, right, is the issue of cultural sensitivity. And I think that Sharon said it in one instance, and I'll give what Sharon said, I will couple with or add to that. I utilize hip hop songs, social media clips, and culturally mirrored material that will allow my participants to receive the material, and we basically engage on what the subject matter is. But there are a lot of things that happens, for example, in a more urban setting that we have to, my staff and I, we have to be creative about making sure that the messaging is appropriate and more or less hitting the target of our student. And we won't spend a lot of time unpacking what the actual material says, but we'll spend a lot more time talking about how we get past this issue of violence in the home. And then lastly, and most importantly, I believe that change is going to come when we can provide the training as well as the resources to the faith community. And therein lies my opportunity. I'm excited to be on this panel and working with this group. I've been excited. I've worked with Sharon now. I believe Sharon's been about maybe 3 years or so, and you have the power. And our goal has been to be able to change the narrative by allowing persons that are at the table to bring issues to the table. Me being a pastor myself, and me being an African-American pastor, and domestic violence in my city is ranging somewhere around 88% touches in the African-American families, okay? And so those are the touches of the offender that reach the court, somewhere close to 88 to 85%, according to the statistics at 201 Poplar and those that we serve. What I find to be very interesting is the faith community knows how to, or I'm sorry, let me change that. The faith community has to be taught how to actively listen for violence cues, where victims are our congregants, especially when we talk about the disparity of the numbers that we face. But then also, we have to have assistance in creating policy. So it will be, let's say, victim safe rather than publicly relevant, right? Or publicly or politically correct. And so we run into, I would say, in the faith community, a very sensitive opportunity to create change, but change has to be very, very well thought out, as well as the person bringing it to the table has to be received. And this is kind of where I believe that my calling has created an opportunity. That myself being, number one, we're in the Bible Belt, and let's just call it what it is. Me being an African-American male pastor, unfortunately, I have to say that, but it makes a whole lot of sense. If I'm not carrying the message, then I would not have the impact that Avis would have, right? Being a female person that's in clergy that's doing the work, but yet, or either of the women that are on this panel may not be received because they are women. Myself being a man, I have to not only carry the torch, but I also have to be responsible for the end user, and which is those persons that are affected by violence. And so in order for things to change, Not only does the faith community have to be a part of the change and a part of this narrative of change, but the faith community has to be trained, as well as those resources be provided for the faith community to capitalize on this opportunity. Because what other way can we show love if by not receiving those that are hurt and harmed?
Wow, huge thoughts. I won't even pretend to be able to follow up on that. Although I do see that maybe Sharon or Avis would like to maybe. I think Avis, do you want to go ahead, and Sharon, if you want to weigh in as well?
Okay, I want to say something to what Pastor Williams was saying about the church and being creative. Going back to what Sharon was saying about being creative, I was a part of the book club, and in that book club, where there were other Black women, they're talking about sexual assault, and they did not feel comfortable doing that in the church. They felt very bad about the fact that they couldn't go to the church. And I didn't realize that so many women felt that way about church because I sat in church. I knew that I wasn't necessarily getting everything I needed when it came to that particular issue in my life. But being creative and having that book club opened up such a door for women to speak. And so I'm just with the whole creative ways of reaching people, before the pandemic and during the pandemic, is that we have to be creative and we've got to open up spaces. And in our churches, we need to be aware that we are not being as effective as we think we are, because I didn't realize how they're not coming to church. They were angry about church, and that the fact that reality was just an eye opening for me. So I just appreciate what you're doing. I want to affirm the book club and the work that the Sexual Assault Center is doing in Black services, because not only did it give me a voice, but it helped me to have the awareness is that there are many other voices that have no place to go. And that was a place to go. So I just want to say that.
Yes, I want to just agree with Pastor Oliver or Pastor Williams, whichever one. I'm a bit more intimate with you with the Oliver name, okay? But I just cannot magnify how important male voices are when it comes to this. Often it is gender-based violence we're talking about, but not always. I want to make sure we know it's not always binary. It can be, within the LGBT plus community. It could be, it could be all in the margins and in the intersections. So I just want to acknowledge that. But it doesn't matter which of these marginalized communities we're talking about. What is important is for men to use their voice to say this is not okay, because it takes another man to hold another man accountable in a lot of ways. It takes a male voice. And I think of the Bill Cosby incident, like for years, there were rumblings among women victims that this kind of behavior was going on, in Hollywood and with Bill Cosby specifically. And nothing ever happened with it because it was women. And then one male comedian made a joke, and it prompted an investigation, right? And I think it was Hannibal Buress. One male's voice prompted an investigation. And it wasn't even him, this is him being funny. So the importance of men being part of the culture shift is critically important. Number one, we live in a patriarchal society and most power is held among men. And if it's a white man that's saying it, oh my gosh, it's even more powerful. And I'm just keeping it 100. It's just the way it is. It's the way we're structured. And so knowing that we're in this all together, it's not a black and white thing. It does look different in those communities, but when we're all using our voice to shift the conversation and shift the community perception and to create more awareness, then we are much more impactful, and we will see that societal change that is possible. Right? We saw it with drunk driving. I don't know how old you guys are, but for my age, back in the day, you ran over somebody drunk, It was a mitigating circumstance. Oh, he was drunk. He didn't mean it. There was no intent. They didn't mean to do it, right? Until somebody ran over somebody's child and that mother got mad. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and changed the whole trajectory of how we see driving and while drunk, right? And now if you do it, you're irresponsible, you're going to jail. Like, there's serious punitive damages with that. And the other thing I want to shift to that Reverend Williams talked about, but it didn't really dig into, is that in a church setting, in a faith-based setting, you don't have an opportunity to separate your victim from your offender. Often they're in the same space at the same time, right? This is not a law enforcement response. And as a pastor, you want to give faith to both sides of this equation. How do we do that if we're always, and I don't like to use the word cancel culture because I think it's been misused and abused in the way that it's been used. But I do think there's a difference between calling somebody out and calling somebody in. You definitely call out the bad behavior for someone who is stepping across the line and is seriously egregious and dangerous and whatever. Those you call out. We handle them. We know what to do with them. The law enforcement responses. There is that stuff that's on the bubble that might not, this might be a red flag at that point. And that's the time when you want to intervene. And that's the time you want to catch it. And that's the time where you want to redirect that behavior. And what faith-based communities have an opportunity to do is just that, to intervene in those spaces and times before it becomes a crime, when it's just a flag, and creating space for both people to heal. I think that's important that we figure that out. Okay, and then that's it for me. My other wish.
I so appreciate it. Hey, when I can just sit here and listen to y'all talking, that's great. I really appreciate that. We do have one more prepared question, and then we can get into Q&A for a few minutes as well. And I mean, yeah. So we'll address the next question, which we're going to turn to Avis to open this one up. The question we prepared is this: events of the past year have led to increased coverage of violent encounters as well as protests by the mass media. Very timely here in Nashville, there was a fatal shooting by an officer last night, and there's a march happening as we speak right now. But the question is, how have you been affected by this trend, the coverage, the attention, and what advice, if any, do you have on coping?
First, I want to tell how I was impacted. When I first would see the marches, I would always feel like, what can I do? I'm have underlying conditions. I can't march. I can't do this right now. And I felt powerless and helpless. And what could I do? And I felt almost like I was lazy, not being representative. And so that was a very difficult space to be in. And then what happened as I began to explore what I could do, my grandchildren were over. Their parents were taking them to the march that was here in Nashville. And so I was able to sit down with them and let them understand what was going on, and then help them prepare a poster that that they could take, and they were able to march. So I had to find my role and what I could do. And that's one part of what I want to say. And then when I'm looking at the marches and I look at the different people that were representative, there were some there that were just, I would call them just knuckleheads that were out there looting and just taking advantage of a situation. There were some that were out there that were impacted by these by powerlessness, and they were there joining with other groups of people, using their power the best way that they could. They were joining with others and with that one common cause, and peacefully protesting and joining with people with other races to make a difference. Then there was the other group that I would see that were prone to be violent, to maybe feel like that's what they had to do to get out what was in their body, what was in their minds, right or wrong. I just saw those groups of people, that different people, their different responses. And so I felt like understanding is what we all need to be able to see people and to understand all those points of views. And in doing that, I think that we will get somewhere by listening and hearing each other, even the ones that you don't agree with, even the ones that were burning, even the ones that were doing things that you say I would not have done and it wasn't peaceful. Understand each other. We're people. And if we can get into the humanity of what's going on in those situations, I think that we will go further as opposed to being on one end or the other end and taking a stance and holding to that one stance and not listening. And so coping for me would be listening. Coping would be for me finding my own role. And so, and I would just offer that as to as a whole of people to be able to just approach this with our humanity. And that's what I wanted. That's my core thing and what I got from it.
Yeah, Avis, I really appreciate that. We're going to move into an open Q&A in just a moment or two, but want to just hang on this for a minute if others have thoughts just about the amount of attention, the media coverage, seeing such numbers take to the streets, and obviously expressing in other ways too. Sharon?
Yeah, it has been extraordinarily overwhelming for me because I already work in an area where I'm dealing with people's trauma. So vicarious trauma has been a real issue in figuring out self-care when you're the helper. Like, what does it mean for me to take care of myself, and how much of this can I take? How much before I veg out and just go watch some reality TV that makes me laugh or makes me cry in a different way, right? It's depending on what show it is. So figuring out what it meant to take care of myself was so very critical during this time. And there's also another thing that came up for me, just having been in these nonprofit areas and these helping areas for the last almost 30 years, which is pretty good. And I haven't burnt out yet. So to get to this place where burnout is like, because I'm burning out in my as a Black woman. And I'm burning out and having to speak up in these spaces that I'm in. Like Avis, I'm not marching anywhere. I'm a march to the refrigerator and back to the couch. That's where I'm marching these days. Okay. But in the spaces that I sit in where decisions are being made, that's where my impact is. And that's where I can use my voice. What I find hard is that it's often muted or ignored, or not enough representation for it to be taken seriously. And so for me, it is really about, I'm not going to be muted anymore. You can say, you can call me whatever you want. You can say what you want about me. I am not going to allow another coworker, another child in my family, another child in my church, another person, another Black man, another anything that looks like me have to endure the same trauma, work-related trauma that I have to deal with on a regular basis. We have got to do a better job of creating more space at the table and better representation all the way around so that people can be heard and feel human and not ignored. And I cannot tell you for the 30 years how many times I've been ignored. I refuse to be ignored anymore. So for me, it's probably more traumatic for my coworkers because I don't shut up. And I'm not gonna shut up. Okay. But and that is really part of my healing, to use my voice and to be present in those spaces and to speak up for these marginalized folks that don't have a place at the table and will never be heard. I see that as part of my responsibility, and it's also part of my healing. And the other thing is just figuring out other ways to take care of myself. I found something called chair yoga. It's wonderful. You don't have to bend over or anything. but it really helped me to kind of deal with how this trauma was showing up in my body. I knew what I was thinking about it. I understood the cognitive part, but I really wasn't paying attention to how it was impacting my health and the health disparities that were coming up as a result of that.
Yeah.
And lastly, as Pastor Williams talked about, there's a pandemic within the pandemic within the pandemic, right? And so it's this violence that I'm seeing over and over again. Nothing was more traumatizing for me than watching the George Floyd trial and seeing this man's life choked out of him 57 times or however many times they showed it over and over and over on TV. That was more traumatic than the actual event. But I felt like I needed to stay present and watch it. And every time it happened, I could feel certain things in my body and in my neck and in my gut that I had to begin to process. So it wasn't just what was going on up here, but it was how it was showing up and figuring out ways and strategies to deal with that type of trauma. So that would be it for me.
Well, it's a lot, and I appreciate you sharing. I also you shared a lot, but I marked down vicarious trauma, which is certainly something that we think about as journalists a lot, and I think we think about it a lot more than we probably used to. So that's I've marked that down among many other notes. I see Elder Williams. Did you want to respond as well?
Yeah, well, my way of coping in assisting in the coping of others is using the pulpit as a place for media as well to launch a hopeful narrative. Preaching on Sunday, allowing what we would call, or what I call, the good news of the gospel, allows for resiliency to become a possibility. And so messaging is the way that I utilize to help change the narrative. So what I am giving out on Sundays and Wednesdays, or whenever we're having worship, I am doing everything I can with the message of the gospel to help communities that are affected by all things that are taking place in their lives. Of course, we have to consider that this pandemic has brought about an awareness, or more or less a reality of death and dying, more so than any other time. Students have lost proms, and in-person graduations and celebrations have all been altered and changed in some sort. And so the messaging that we utilize is just as it was said by Sharon about how the messaging continues to come round and around. I try to do the same thing every Sunday. I try to make sure that everybody that comes through my doors, or every person that hears my voice, is hearing something that's hopeful, rather than the message that exists that all things are bad. And so in the midst of a pandemic, I always talk about the potential within. And even in times like these, there is hope. And I'm hoping and I'm hopeful for the messaging of the church, and the potential that we have, if in fact that we in the faith community can come to the table and create an opportunity for persons to hear something hopeful and take that message and face the impossibilities that they face.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm just going to note for time here, we have about 10 minutes before we'll have some concluding remarks. We are sort of entering here the open Q&A. We do have a question in here that I want to make sure I get to the group. Maybe Jared or Alexandra might want to take a crack at this one. So the question is coming in from one of our participants, speaking as a survivor, who has had a hard time speaking up in the moment, who notes, even well-intending police officers do not always see the danger the victim is in, because the abuser is often a very smooth talker, or maybe has had time to prepare maybe more than the victim. How can we help victims and officers to better communicate, as well as to look for signs of abuse beyond just physical scars? I'm wondering if maybe Jared or Alexandra would want to talk about this a bit.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. I'll be glad to take that. I think goes back to what we talked about earlier, training with our officers. And in the context of domestic violence, the lethality assessment, those are objective measures that the officer is trained to gather, and then pass those on to the people who can evaluate that case. Your judges, when they're setting bail for the offender, when the prosecutor is assessing the proper way to proceed with that case, that information has to be shared. And if we train the officers to gather the information and be more of a fact finder and not necessarily the ultimate decision maker, and the more eyes we have on a situation, the greater the chance, I think, that we'll arrive at the right decision. And training those officers to gather that information and to pass it on to your prosecutors, to your judges, to your victim advocates, we really improve the chances of us getting it right.
Do we have others who want to comment on that dynamic? Alexandra?
To share very briefly, we have used some training with law enforcement that and our advocates even that kind of help point out tactics that abusers will use, because yes, there are many times where they have thought through what they are going to say, or will flip the story and turn the victim into the perpetrator. And we also help law enforcement recognize the impact of trauma on that victim, and how what they're going to recall is maybe disjointed, or shut down, that they won't recall because of the traumatic events going on, so that they're not necessarily perceived as wait a minute, their story's sketchy, it's not adding up, it's impacted by trauma. But those are also things that, yes, training is really important for law enforcement to be able to recognize some of these things that could be happening. And to your point, judges, that we're going to document information, help to make a clear investigation, and then turn that over, hopefully to trained judges as well, who have that good insight. That there's work to be done there too.
Yeah, we are in a bit of a open final 5 or 6 minutes here for folks. I'm not seeing, there is a question in here about whether the panelists have read a certain book. I see that. I think the panelists can go ahead and type a response there. The book Hope Rising, in which the authors apply the science of hope to helping victims. So we might be able to address that question just in sort of the chat. Although if anyone's moved to talk about that, we can do that. Not seeing other questions, I would circle back to one thing that was mentioned earlier, which is the new prevalence of body camera footage and the impact that is having optically on not just survivors but all of us. Wondering if anybody cares to weigh in on that. And I'll defer that question if other questions pop in.
I think body camera footage has created a way to see the story that is often hidden or overshadowed. But yet, even though you get a clip, right, it's doesn't always capture some of the other narratives that exist. And I think that what's unfortunate in this day and time is things are manipulated or withheld. And so it creates a narrative that sometimes infects the situation that's already volatile. And so we've made some steps forward, but I will say that the incremental success of body cam footage it's good that we have it. I'm just hopeful for that footage to expand to create a better narrative for us in time. It's not going to happen overnight, but I'm hopeful that the patience that we have the patience to wait on it to improve itself.
Yeah, sure. And I do think it's deep water to talk about that. We do have another question that's come in from one of our participants. I'll read it out and we'll see if someone wants to weigh in. After a parent has been convicted of some form of child abuse toward their children, what are the rights of the child if a non-offending parent wants to welcome the abuser back into their home? Pretty specific question here. Can we talk to that a little bit? I can read it one more time. After a parent has been convicted of some form of child abuse, what are the rights of the child if a non-offending parent wants to welcome the abuser back into the home? And perhaps we don't have an exact
Well, Tony, I'm not.
rights response. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't deal directly with child abuse cases. But my service to the offender, I have worked with DCS with parents that have been offenders of child abuse, and I will say that it could be a violation of whatever policy that's in place, right? And so I think the specific question is, what are the rights of the child? If the child is not 18 years old, I don't know in the state of Tennessee if that child has a right to bring that person in. But if the non-offending parent brings that person into the home, that non-offending parent could face charges, depending upon the circumstance. So that question has a lot of layers to it that I don't think that I would give justice to it. But I will say it in this fashion. I have seen it within my own practice that persons that were child abuse offenders have very strict limitations, and any violation of that puts the child at harm. And so removing things just for the sake of, for example, simple visitation could simply put the child in danger, and all persons involved could potentially commit a crime.
I appreciate that answer. And I know from covering the Second Look Commission, which is closely involved with Tennessee DCS, that enforcing those terms or seeing that those terms are adhered to is a perpetual challenge. The Second Look Commission, if I recall correctly, has had that finding in their annual report like many years in a row, that actually making sure that those guidelines are followed, or not guidelines, that those orders are followed is difficult. I do not see another question that has come in. We are supposed to be wrapping up here in a moment so that You Have the Power can share some resources. I do want to give anybody just another moment, though, any of the panelists here, to share any other parting thoughts or any connections you've sort of made, just hearing from one another, if anybody is interested in sharing. Well, I think we're going to get maybe Vladimir and You Have the Power back on here in a moment to go over some resources. At least for my part, I'll say I've learned a lot. I've scribbled out a lot of notes, and I will be thinking about this not just for the rest of the day, but going forward. So I really appreciate all of our panelists, and just really happy to, hey, on a rainy day, this is a perfect day for a roundtable Zoom panel, right? So I've gotten a lot out of it. So I really appreciate everybody's participation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Tony, and thank all of you. I think we've had a very meaningful, powerful conversation lately today. Now, I would like to conclude this event with an overview of the resources available to you as survivors of crime and advocates on their behalf. Now, links to all of these resources are going to go out to everyone after today's webinar. Just allow me just 1 second. All right. There we go. Now, the first piece of information I'd like to bring up isn't so much a resource, but a statement of your rights as a crime survivor. Andrea Conti, our founder, helped draft the Tennessee Crime Victims Bill of Rights and get it adopted by the General Assembly. Now, this is a Crime Victims Bill of Rights. It's reproduced here, but it's also available on the website of the Tennessee Department of Correction. and that's going to be included in the links I'll send out after this webinar. Let's see, I'll look that up a little bit so you can read it. Just to see what it looks like. Again, this is on the TDOC website, and you'll get a link to it after this. Let's see. On You Have the Power's end, we maintain a crime survivors guide that serves as a resource on the Tennessee criminal justice system, written with the victim and the victim's family in mind. Topics covered include going to court, what to do when you get there, what to say, what to wear, and the finer points of the sentencing and parole process, and how to make a victim impact statement. It also provides information on the Tennessee Sex Offender Registry, and again, your rights as a victim of crime. Now, a digital copy of this is available at the link provided here. Again, this will be included in what we send out later. You can order hard copies of the guide and any of the others available from You Have the Power through the contact points we'll share at the very end of the session. Okay. On to national resources. The National Center for Victims of Crime is a nonprofit organization that advocates for victims' rights, trains professionals who work with victims, and serves as a trusted resource of information on victims' issues. It provides crime survivors with direct services such as attorney referrals, confidential helplines, and interactive trainings. Make sure to check out their youth advocacy resources, which I provided here as a separate link. This section offers tools you can use to protect and respond to young victims of crime in your area. Meanwhile, the Office of Victims of Crime, a division of the U.S. Department of Justice, and the underwriter of today's presentation, offers toll-free hotlines and websites for assorted violent and nonviolent crimes, and links to state and federal victim notification systems. Now, again, all these links are going out at the end of this webinar. You'll probably get them tomorrow. With that said, this concludes today's presentation. We hope everyone involved has found an opportunity for insight, connection, and learning from each other. I want to thank Tony and all of our panelists for taking time out of their Saturday to join us. And we'd also like to thank NABAA and OBC for supporting this event. But most importantly, most of all, we want to thank you, both the advocates and the survivors, for sharing your experiences and knowledge to make things easier for crime victims in Tennessee. You'll see all of our socials represented right here. Now, our Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok handles are provided directly. For the others, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, just go to those particular social media platforms and search for You Have the Power. And once more, after this webinar, you're going to get an email with all the resources we've just described, along with a certificate of participation. And let me just get out of here in a second. Now, if you've got any follow-up questions or comments, you can reach us by phone or email the contact points listed. Let me just throw that up one more second. So you can see that once more. There's our website, yhtp.org. You can send your questions to webinars@yhtp.org. And there's our phone number, 615-292-7027. This is usually in the office during standard business hours. Mailing address here. Right, done.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. It's been such a pleasure. Alexandra and Sharon, Oliver, Jared and Avis, and Tony. You guys have shared just a wealth of information, so thank you.
All right then. Good day, everyone. Have a nice weekend.